better sex and more pleasure. It's something many of us want but don't want to talk about.
The human body is made for pleasure. Every bit of your body can give you an intense amount of pleasure. It just depends on how you treat it.
That's why I've invited sex educator Seema Anand onto the show to destigmatize sex, debunk myths, and help us inject a bit more pleasure into our lives.
If you could actually spend a bit more time exploring different narratives, exploring different spots on your body, you'd be amazed at how much you can extend your own pleasure diet.
We find out whether you should be planning your sexy time, why you should be listening to erotic podcasts, and how couples can reignite a lost sexual spark.
Being in bed together, lying down together, naked. Just get the feel of each other's skin again. But, and I have to stress this, take the idea of sex off the table.
And we'll even get into the true message of the Kama Sutra.
The Kama Sutra says that you should be able to bring a woman to orgasm at least twice before you penetrate her.
I'm Dr. Karan, an NHS surgeon, and in this podcast, we cut through the BS of modern health advice and tackle the biggest issues in science, health, and medicine. Sex is something we find incredibly difficult to talk about, and because of that, many people don't understand how to find true sexual pleasure. They don't spend enough time exploring their own bodies, and they struggle to ask for advice or even to talk to their partner about what they want. Shame, cultural stigma, and modern religious perceptions of sex all factor into this. And to be honest, men often don't understand what women want and need. That's why we have the orgasm gap, where 95% of men reach orgasm during sex, but only 65% of women. Seema Anand is an expert on sexual pleasure and is here to help us close these inequities and improve our relationships and sex lives. She's a leading authority on the Kama Sutra, and she has fascinating advice from this ancient Indian text. Several thousand years ago, there was a lot of intertwining between religion and sex. I mean, if you look at the roots of Hinduism, it's a very sexy religion.
They don't shy away from the sexual side of things. Absolutely.
Yeah, you could even argue in some of the kind of original texts, it's very vulgar in some senses in terms of how we would perceive it nowadays. But then it seems there's a discord between the kind of ancient Hinduism and the ancient Hindu beliefs and the current modern neo-Hinduism, where it seems almost very puritanical and shies away from sex as much as it can.
I just think that a lot of it comes from ignorance. They have absolutely no idea what the ancient texts talk about. If you were to read the Shiv Puran, even today, it is absolutely not what you expect to read in there. You'd be amazed, you'd be surprised, you'd be like, really? Did they actually say that? But I was actually thinking about this earlier today, that there is a text. This is now, we think it goes back to the 1st century. Our dates are a little bit fluid. But there is this text that actually says to parents, don't stop your daughters from playing jumping games, because it is only through this that she will build up her strength and her energy to take her position on top when she's with her partner. And if she doesn't have that strength, she will collapse under the weight of her own thighs. I mean, that's the verse. So 2000 years ago, we're telling parents that they must understand that their daughter's pleasure life is going to be extremely important, that they must help her to prepare for it. In 2024, we have a whole rash of men talking about the importance of the hymen. That if she's not a virgin, then she's impure. And the jumps that they take from, a woman's value is in her purity. And somebody actually wrote to me the other day saying, because I was like, no, a woman's value is in the fact that she's a human being. It's got nothing to do with her purity. And he said, well, if there's no such thing as purity, then are you saying that a woman should have sex with her father? And I was like, where did that jump come? I mean, where did you take that leap? How does that even happen? So I personally think that because religion has suddenly become it's become so weaponized that if you associate anything to that, it's just a way of controlling people further. Most of these people have never read an ancient text in their lives, but, they've read headlines.
And so the Kama Sutra, everyone most likely has heard of the Kama Sutra either in a movie or just in passing online. And I believe a lot of people have this perception of the Kama Sutra as this perverted, filthy sex guide, this ancient sex book full of profanities and vulgarities and atrocious acts. And actually, that's far from the truth. So for someone listening who has heard of the Kama Sutra, who actually doesn't know what is the Kama Sutra?
Okay, so very briefly, the Kama Sutra was written in approximately the 4th century. It was written for men. This is a time when women are not taught how to read or write. So this is written for wealthy men of the court, wealthy men of leisure. And it's written as a book on how to live their best life when it comes to their emotional dealings. So it's written in 7 sections. The first section deals with how a man should build his house, how he should pick a location, how many bedrooms he should have. If he has a mistress, then where should the bedroom for the mistress be placed? If he actually is married and he has a wife, where should the wife's bedroom be placed? How he should decorate the house, how many hours he should spend talking to his minor birds and his parrots. I always wonder why we have like 2 to 3 hours of talking to minor birds and parrots. Maybe it was learning how to get into conversation. I don't know. I mean, I'm always intrigued. It tells you how many hours he should spend being massaged, how many hours he should spend bathing, and so on. So that's section 1. Section 2 is on the arts of pleasure. And this is the only section that really interests me because it's the only section that I feel is still relevant to us. And interestingly, it is the only section where Vatsyayan, who we think is the author of the Kama Sutra, actually addresses the men and the women equally. And so he refers to what pleasures a woman, he refers to what pleasures a man. So he kind of talks on both sides of it. Section 3 teaches men how to look for the perfect wife. And their idea of perfect wives range from the usual stereotypes to some rather interesting ideas about how you should not marry a woman whose name ends with a R or a L. And it shouldn't marry a woman whose name is the name of a river or a tree. I mean, some very strange ideas again. Section 4 tells you how to marry this particular woman once you found her, thinking always about whether you have a family or not. And I think this is quite interesting because in modern India, till today, there are sections of society where you will not even get to see your partner-to-be till the wedding day. Your parents will go and find them for you. And I'm talking about some of the communities, maybe not in urban India, but certainly there are still communities that do that. And this is at a time when it says that now that you found her, the idea is to get her to fall in love with you. And so who are the sort of people that you should engage and as go-betweens? Who should you send messages with? Who should you pay so that you could they can talk you up, basically. So, your wingmen. So section 4 is all about that. Section 5 tells you about how to seduce another man's wife. In case the other man is in a powerful position and you need to access their power, you go through the wife. So it's all about the politics. Section 6 is on the rules around courtesanery. So this is at a time when we believe that the very famous politician Chanakya was in power as the minister to the king, and he had made sex work legal. And there's a ministry for it. They collect taxes for it, and they believe that it is extremely important. And there are a lot of rules around that. So section 6 outlines the rules for what a courtesan can or can't do, should or shouldn't do, what is the property that will legally belong to them, what doesn't, and so on. And section 7, we believe, was added later. It's a rather silly section on love potions and aphrodisiac remedies, which is really, really weird. But so that is, in brief, the Kama Sutra. Section 2, which is the section on pleasure, has a tiny little chapter. When I say tiny, I mean it's not that small, but it's not particularly big. It has a small chapter on positions. The largest chapter actually is on oral sex, teaching you how to perform oral sex in lots of different ways, because anything that becomes the same is monotonous and doesn't work for you. And as a medic, you might find this interesting. He says that most people tend to have oral sex in exactly the same way, which means that you stimulate a certain set of nerves and the other nerves never get stimulated, and this causes an imbalance. So he tells you how you should be doing things to, well, mix it up a little bit. Also, it kind of talks about the ethics behind it. So what are the different beliefs around oral sex? Positions, again, which most people think is so important, and I do want to address this. There was a very interesting reason for the positions. Vatsan says that sex should always be about pleasure. If you're not having pleasure, ultimate pleasure, there's no point having sex. And he says that the very first prerequisite to good, pleasurable sex is that the genital organs should match in size. Because if the woman is too big and the man is too tiny, there's no friction, there's no pleasure. If the man is too large, the woman is just going to feel a lot of pain. So how do you make sure that the size is synchronized? Because nobody really ever gets together by first checking the size of their partner. I mean, like nobody ever sort of said, we would like your daughter's hand in marriage, but, what is the size of her vagina? So these positions were supposed to help you synchronize the sizes if the sizes were very different. So it tells you that if the woman is really tiny, what are the best positions for her? But it's not just what are the best positions. It also tells you, it goes into the emotional side of it. It says that if she's really, really tight and really tiny, and okay, you're supposed to have your legs wide open, you're supposed to do this, put a pillow on, but this can also then make the woman very nervous because she's already really tight and she's thinking now somebody can just penetrate me and just get there and I have no control. So it also tells her how she can take control herself by adjusting her body, what all she should do. So it's actually quite a fascinating text.
Yeah, I mean, from what you've said, I think it completely breaks down those misconceptions a lot of people would have. And I think, that sort of nicely, takes me on to another thing I really wanted to discuss, which is pleasure. Pleasure is a huge part of sex, and for many people, it is the main thing. That's often is the point of separation between humans and other species. We reproduce as well as copulate for pleasure. Now, when it comes to pleasure, clearly, a couple of years ago, I spoke to a sex therapist on a podcast. And one of the things that she was talking about, which really struck a chord with me, was the inequalities in the frequency of orgasms between men and women. And it was heterosexual women have significantly fewer orgasms than bisexual or homosexual women. And overwhelmingly, whatever your sexual orientation as a woman, you have less orgasms than a man. And when we look at disparities between men and women, the gender gap, the health gap, the pay gap, the pain gap, the orgasm gap is another one of those disparities. Why do you think that is?
Primarily because over the centuries, we've been taught that there is only one way to have sex, and that is through penis and vagina penetration. And I mean, a text this long back says that this is the least likely way that a woman can have pleasure. And that the only real way to get past this, for most women, they will tell you that it's the clitoris that will, just stimulating the clitoris, which will give them the pleasure. A lot of women actually find the clitoris a little too much to handle. A lot of them can't actually handle that. They get really anxious and they start to hyperventilate with it. And so we are trying to say to people that actually the human body is made for pleasure. Every bit of your body can give you an intense amount of pleasure. It just depends on how you treat it, what you do with it. Unfortunately, we've not really managed to get this through to people. And so everybody still thinks that, because Freud said it, that the only mature orgasm is the penetrative one. Everything else is juvenile. And I mean, he's just basically caused dysfunction across the board for generations. The Kama Sutra says that you should be able to bring a woman to orgasm at least twice before you penetrate her.
Interesting.
through different ways of kissing her and so on. The physiology of men and women is different. So how a man experiences pleasure is that there is a steep sort of rise. You get to the pleasure point, and after that, men are generally pretty much spent. It's very difficult for them to come back to their second wind after that first ejaculation. Let's call it an orgasm. An ejaculation is not always an orgasm, but it's close enough to it. For women, however, the more orgasms you have, the more excited you get, the higher your sexual energy goes. So you're not spent after the first orgasm. You recover really quickly and you're ready for the next one. This kind of warms you up. I just think that we also went through a phase where pleasure was not part of the sexual process. I mean, let's face it, you did not have sex for pleasure, and particularly for women. It was horrific to think that that would even be a thing. Go back about 100 years, Victorian England, at least what we're taught is that their sensibilities would have been terribly offended if we had tried to talk about women's pleasure. So we just come from an area of history where pleasure was not supposed to be the done thing. Hence, nobody paid any attention to it, and hence nobody understands how to access that pleasure.
And it's interesting you say as well how in the Kama Sutra text that a woman should have 2 orgasms before, penetrative sex, and talking about erogenous zones. I mean, the biggest erogenous zone is the skin. So technically, you can orgasm from any stimulation anywhere in your body. It's a influence of the mind plus any sort of cutaneous stimulation, whether that's genital or non-genital. And a lot of the things that you've said and what is spoken about in the Kama Sutra aligns with a lot of the neuroscience that sex researchers are researching. And when I was digging into this sex research, when I was having a conversation with a sex therapist a couple of years ago, there was a very well-renowned researcher, Dr. Barry Komisaruk, and out of America. And a lot of the research that he conducted looked at the orgasm routes in men and women. And what I found fascinating was that men are very simple in that there's one main route to orgasm. There is stimulation of the genitals, the penis, and you get a direct route, pudendal nerve stimulation. It goes to the brain and you get an orgasm. That's the very simple one-track mind feedback route for men. But in women, there are lots of different ways of orgasm. As you mentioned, vaginal orgasm, clitoral orgasm, cervical orgasm as well, and various other erogenous zones. And as you mentioned, the vaginal stimulation, and you mentioned the discourse that Freud had, Sigmund Freud, in saying that vaginal stimulation was the mature way, etc. And it seems like that is the hardest route of orgasm to achieve. And when someone does achieve a vaginal orgasm, it's a more visceral, deeper sensation because it stimulates the vagus nerve and internal nerves. The clitoral stimulation is more of an external stimulation and produces a different type of orgasm. And the cervical stimulation as well stimulates various nerves, the hypogastric nerves and other cervical nerves as well. And that is what I find fascinating, is that everyone is different. Every relationship is different. Every woman is different. Anatomy is different. So there is no one size fits all formula for every single one person. So although you can have people who advise on certain things for, one woman, one man, one relationship, or 2 women in a relationship, it could be completely different for each individual.
It absolutely can. But, I just want to also step in here and say that a lot of men will get to this point at some point in their lives where they find that their pleasure diet is so restricted, and actually pleasure goes out of their lives. They are no longer able to get the kind of pleasure that they could once feel with penetrative sex, because that is their general go-to. Like you said, it's a very automatic kind of reaction. Go there, do it, finished. The human body, not just women just spend a lot more time exploring the different parts of their body to see what else will give them pleasure, because the vaginal penetration doesn't generally do it for most of us. So we will spend a lot more time trying to figure out what else will work for us. Unfortunately, men don't have the patience to do that. And I'm always trying to say to men that if you were to give yourself just a little bit of time, I know it's much easier to just go back, stimulate the penis, get to that point, get a hard on, ejaculate, and you're done. You're ready to go. But if you could actually spend a bit more time exploring different narratives, exploring different spots on your body, you'd be amazed at how much you can extend your own pleasure diet. And it's something that they can then have for much longer in their lives, because honestly, just doing the one thing is not going to take you through 70, 80 years of life. And there should be no reason to stop. So that's just one point that I really want to, I want to stress it as much as possible, that everybody is capable of this. But also this thing that when you said about how we kind of accept a certain version of pleasure. We take somebody else's view on it. We take somebody else's advice on it. Everybody's pleasure, like you just said, is so individual. You need to explore your own pleasure, but somehow that's seen as a bad thing. So you don't do it. Our brain is where it actually happens. Like you said, it sets us apart from the animals. This is where the first pinging takes place, that first bit of excitement. And if you can build up a narrative over here that's going to lead you to pleasure, that's half the job done. Your body will just follow. In ancient times, they again used to make sure that people understood how to have sex. So how you do a particular position, it's not enough to say, all right, we're going to try this position where the woman is on top and she's got one leg stuck in the air. All that is great. But what do you actually do to make sure that there is pleasure involved, not just some kind of acrobatic feat that you're going to accomplish? So women were taught how to do these positions by wearing different parts of jewelry, different pieces of jewelry, and how that jewelry moved on their body would then define how they moved in that position. And men were taught, and I'm going to tell you about this, I'm going to blow your mind. Men were taught how to do these positions and understand what is the emotion behind that position through describing different battle positions. So they had different vocabulary, because men tend to be more physical. They don't use the brain so much. Women tend to be more over here and they don't use the body so much. So there's that disconnect between each person's sexual abilities. So women were taught. So for instance, if the woman was going to be on top, and if you watch porn today, you'll notice that, you have the woman on top going bounce, bounce, bounce on top of the man. This is how the camera picks it up, because I guess it's good for the camera. Women were told that for doing, and honestly, Karan, that I can say this for almost every woman, there is no pleasure involved, because you miss every single one of those erogenous spots in the bouncing for the woman. Because in that, you actually are missing all of the little erotic spots that are dotted around the vagina. And this is my favorite bit. And this is where I actually decided that my research had to be a lot deeper when I got to this point. Women were told that if they were going to be on top, they would wear jingling girdles around their upper waist. So lots and lots of ghungroos, lots of bells on this girdle. And then they were told that when you're on top, those jingling girdles should not make a sound.
Wow, okay.
Okay. Now you imagine you're only focusing, you're not trying to figure out how you should be moving. You're only focusing on understanding how to not move so that you don't make a sound with those bells.
So that forces you to not bounce and improve your, sexual relationship in that moment.
Well, it literally forces you to use because that's now the mission, is to not get the bells to ring. Yeah. So you're understanding that you're moving your body back and forth, maybe slightly round and round. You have the grind, rounding motion. And that is where now you are connecting with every single one of your little G spots inside you. There isn't just the one, there's lots of them in there. And with this, they would say that if you're on top, you would wear long earrings, so long dangling earrings, which would move in an arc against your cheek. And when you got that movement right, it set the pace for the thrusting. And that showed you how to actually have sex. Now, I just think that I think it's beautiful, but more than being beautiful, whenever I talk about this to women, it gets their imagination excited. It gets them thinking, oh, I want to try this. Whether they ever achieve it or not is not the point. But suddenly they're in the zone. They're not just, oh my God, I haven't managed to wash the dishes and I have to do this. And shit, do I wake up in enough time to make my kids' lunchbox the next morning? They are now in the zone.
You know, I think we romanticize this idea too much about spontaneity and just leaving everything to chance. And ultimately, when you're talking about the Kama Sutra as this essentially sex guide, and from what you've said and a lot of the sex research has said, and there's one study also which I found quite interesting. It's called the Male Study, and it was essentially a survey-based study where they asked lots of questions to the partners of women who are undergoing the menopause, and questions about various things, including sexual health as well. And there's two main outcomes which I found very interesting about that study. It was number one, that men didn't know very much about what their partners were going through. And number two was that there was an appetite to know more. They wanted to know more about their partners, so they could make their quality of life better from the menopause side of things, but also their quality of sex life better, because there could be a deterioration in sex life and libido during the perimenopause and menopause with the lowering of the estrogen, vaginal dryness, and associated, urogenital dysfunction. Given that information is there, that there is an appetite from men to actually want to know more and how to please their partners, and apart from the things you've mentioned now, exploring other things apart from just the easiest route to orgasm, which often is the primary focus for men, what are other things that a man can do in a relationship to satisfy their partner?
Okay, so I think one of the biggest problems is literally, when people find that they're no longer having sex and they want sex, they think that the way to get about it is to ask for more sex. Okay, so it's like, okay, we're not having sex and we're losing our intimacy. We need more sex. And actually, that isn't the right way to go about it, because there must be a reason why your partner has gone off it. Like you said, there's a million different things that the female body goes through. And quite honestly, there gets a point where you're tired, you're not in the right mental frame. One of the things that people don't talk about with menopause is the fogginess. I mean, you are just completely, you walk around in a bit of a haze. You can't focus. The last thing you want is somebody jumping on you and saying, well, we haven't had sex for a while. This is now the time to do it. You can't. That's not intimacy. So I think what I always say to people is that one of the things that you need to do is start building that relationship up again. And I think one of the nicest ways to do this is by doing physical activity together. Going on a hike, go for a walk, make a dish together. I don't know, anything that actually takes the pressure of sex off the table. Yeah. You're out there on a guided tour, on a walk, looking at a building. You're enjoying time with each other. The first thing to do is literally to build that up, to say, I want to spend time with you. We're literally having to start from point zero. I want to spend time with you. I spent that time with you. It felt so good. It felt like old times. It felt like we were connected.
So you want to replicate that dating mentality almost?
Absolutely. The second thing, and you know what? A lot of people have this problem about, we shouldn't have scheduled sex. The Kama Sutra is very, very prescriptive. It says that for most people, there are very few people who are sort of inherently, intrinsically really good at the intimate stuff. They just know what to do. For most people, they need a framework. They need a little framework to work within, and then they can get as creative as they want because that energy is contained. The second thing that I think really, really works, and it's the one thing that we lose, no sex, but start to have cuddle time with each other. Watch TV, watch your favorite stand-up comedian, by being in bed together, lying down together, naked. Just get the feel of each other's skin again. We forget over time how good it feels just to be in each other's arms, to feel the other person's skin. Get one-on-one naked skin time, it's one of the nicest things you can do. But, and I have to stress this, take the idea of sex off the table just because she might get really excited. It is very exciting. You might kiss, you might feel each other. Don't push it. Don't be like, okay, now we're at this point. This is what we're going to do. Learn to hold back. If you want this in the longer term, you need to build this up. You need to have her wanting to come back to you. And finally, I think, which I think really is important for men and women, well, for everybody. When you make love, whatever that making love might be to you, there's always bits of it that you really like. The rest of it, for most people, is like, yeah, fine, I have to do this. There's always one bit of it that you do really enjoy. Extend that bit, because you will then find that your partner comes back to your bed because this is the bit that they're waiting for. This is the bit that draws them back to you. For a lot of women, it's the cuddling afterwards. Just lying in each other's arms, talking about something totally basic, mundane maybe, but it's just that feeling of being loved, feeling of somebody caring enough to just sort of chat to you about things that are worrying you in the afterglow. And I think it's just so amazing because that's something that women will literally come back for. You've got to excite the imagination. You've got to somewhere here change the desires again. I think for a lot of people, they don't seem to understand that, a lot of people will say, oh, well, the menopause came and our sex life went down the tubes. The menopause comes and it does go. There is an ability to come back to sex after that. But if it hasn't been terribly good beforehand, she's not going to make the hugest effort to come back to it. If it was good, she's wanting to get back to it.
And I think everything that you've just said there highlights the importance of not choosing to be in a relationship with someone purely on just a physical lust basis. Because as you mentioned there, for that long-term sustainability in a relationship, when, the sex or the enjoyment or the pleasure does dry up for whatever reason, whether it's medical reasons or social reasons or psychological reasons, there has to be something else there on a cerebral level to bring two people back together again, to then have something physical, if that was something that was wished. And out of many of the factors which could affect a relationship on a bedroom sex level, that affects the quality of sex life, often it can be the libido, the appetite, the sexual appetite on one or both sides. If we're taking away physical causes for libido being affected, so in women, something like perimenopause or menopause, or in men, for example, if they've got some psychological stressor or some, heart disease, which is affecting erections, for example, or they've on medication, which affects their libido. What is something that can help to improve libido in general in a sexual relationship, do you feel?
Okay, so one of the things that I find really helps is erotic podcasts. So actually listening in. And if you are easy enough and comfortable enough with your partner, lie down together, turn the lights off, and actually listen to this together. It's incredibly useful because unlike porn, which is very visual, it gets you there, you're done, and it's a little bit, it leaves you feeling like, what happened? This is a slower build-up. And it gives you the chance to be totally with each other because it's in the background, it's a sound coming over. But it's quite amazing because, again, a lot of people are a little nervous or a little shy about trying out role play. But having somebody else doing the role play behind you with just the audio, it's really, really useful. So I think guided self-pleasure podcasts, there aren't that many about, but there are some. Something that we should all consider maybe putting out. Maybe that's the next podcast, Karan.
That is no, it's an interesting concept because there must be a reason why erotic podcasts exist in the first place. Clearly there is a niche and a big audience of listeners, and also there's a whole literary genre of erotic fantasy novels, and which exist as well, which have a huge readership. And arguably these kind of erotic novels are right up there with sci-fi and biographies and everything else. So leaning into other senses apart from just the physical, the visual, the auditory, the smell even, I guess that is quite important in building and fostering that libido and closeness as well with your partner.
It's so important. And, the thing is that you can be really, really close to your partner and you can get to that point of feeling very connected, but it can also become really sort of brotherly love. You know what I mean? Like, because you can start looking at them as just somebody that you are so comfortable with and easy with. So I think it's quite nice to be able to add this little detail in. Keep your own pleasure senses alive so that you want to actually explore them further, because it really doesn't help if it's just the other person wanting it. You've got to be responsible for your own pleasure senses.
How do you get rid of shame in a relationship? Because clearly you've got two people who have come together and they may be wildly different in terms of their wants and needs. And one person may not like something as a sexual practice and another person may want that same thing. And there could be a number of different idiosyncrasies between these two people. How does someone get over that fear of expressing what they want and what they don't want in a relationship? Because ultimately, again, to have a sustainable, healthy sex life, you need to be open and honest.
So I think that that's probably one of the most difficult things to do, because I think it's easier to say what you don't want, but to actually ask for what you want, you are at risk of your partner saying, "Oh, for God's sakes, I don't believe you just said that." I get letters on this all the time, particularly if it is the woman saying, "I want to try this." And the man is like, it's almost like it's a shameful idea. How can you, you've been watching too much porn. You do. And one of the things, you don't actually know what you want. You've just been watching this and you think you want it. So it is a little bit, it's a little bit scary to open yourself up to that. In terms of when a man once said, I find that because a lot of times they won't explain the whole thing, it scares the hell out of the woman. So I've had a lot of women writing in saying, my partner, we're getting married very soon, and my partner says that he wants to watch me getting injections in the bottom and other ways that will give me pain. And is it because, I actually had one young girl say, is it because I've had a sexual partner before and he just wants to punish me for that? So there is just this lack of trust, unfortunately. Because if you feel that you're going to say something and the other person is going to take it amiss, it is a real problem, which is why I think that the easier way into some of this is by listening to the erotic podcasts. Because when you share some of this, it just breaks down certain barriers. You're listening to somebody else talk about it and you realize, maybe I'm not the only, or maybe they're not the only person who's thinking like that. There's an actual podcast around this. I just think conversation, of course, is really important. Podcasts like this, where you can actually talk about different types of fetishes and fantasies, really important. I think that we need to make more programs that are more language accessible for communities around the world, because there's a lot of communities, even a place like London, where you and I both live. There are a lot of very diverse communities, and their ideas and beliefs on sexual pleasure are poles apart from each other. The more that we can have of these conversations and shows, maybe, I think it's one step closer to helping break down those barriers.
And what do you feel, I mean, it might be a difficult question to answer, but what would be some red flags in the bedroom? For example, I've heard from many people, and actually there is a growing voice online that suggests that sexual practices and sexual relationships are becoming increasingly rough and violent. Partly this may be due to the increased viewership of pornography and the sometimes quite aggressive nature of the sexual acts which are occurring in pornography, and people wanting to replicate that in real life as well. Sometimes it's difficult to do that, but in an attempt to do this, there may be an increasingly abusive sexual practice and rough and violence in sex going on, which I guess it's difficult to say to any one person that's a bad thing if that's something they enjoy, but obviously there's always a spectrum of what is acceptable, what is maybe not acceptable. Are there any red flags in that situation, in your point of view, or people that have come to you with questions?
Okay, yes. So I think that the term that we need to look at is consent. And I think we need to look at it very carefully, and not just as this basic idea of, do you want sex? Yes, I do, or no, I don't. If your partner wants you to do something that you're not comfortable with, you find yourself hesitating. You find yourself saying, no, I don't want to. They will then try and convince you. Might try and convince you several times. And you might go away, think about it. You might think, okay, I'm going to try it. And then on further thinking, you might think, no, actually, I really don't want to. I think that at any point, if you feel that you are being pushed into something, even though you don't want to do it, I think that's a huge red flag. So I was talking to my kids about this. My youngest is 26 and my youngest is a daughter. And unlike the boys, she tends to talk to me a little bit more. And I think we discovered that one of the things that in their language would be a huge red flag is if there was something that their partner was doing that they could not come and talk to their best friend about. If it's something that you're actually thinking, shit, they're doing this, but I don't want to talk about it because how will people view me? Or how will people view my partner the next time they meet him, or whatever. But if it is bothering you that much, it is a huge, huge red flag.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important that you mentioned there, that consent. And I guess a lot of the sexual practices and things we've spoken about relating to sex so far has been centered around women, but there's no shortage of misinformation and lack of knowledge when it comes to men's sexual health practices. I see large groups of young men online following very strange protocols like semen retention, no FAP, where there's some belief that if they don't masturbate, they will boost their testosterone, gain some focus and clarity. And all of this is nonsense because there's no peer-reviewed publications or scientific literature which suggests this. And a lot of these weird fads are just based on anecdotal evidence or one authority figure in the kind of men's health world saying something. What are some of those common men's sexual health myths that you encounter on a frequent basis?
Okay, so the biggest one is this one about no FAP, or, not masturbating means that your sexual energy will travel to your brain and it will make your brain light up. I think that the original idea of this came from the fact that if you can learn to control your body, you can develop a great deal of self-control. It literally came from that point. As you know, you're a doctor, that your semen or your sperm or whatever else it is does not travel up to the brain and, set it on fire. It literally came from the idea of being able to practice self-control, build up self-will. I think, like most things, it becomes a trend and then it gets derailed. So people have come up with all sorts of mythology around it, and they've lost the idea of what it was meant to be. So the idea of torturing your body seems to be a terribly popular trend at the moment. You torture your body to make it feel a certain way, and then you come out of it saying, look at me, I did this to myself, and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, whenever I've tried saying that this is not correct, I get told no penis, no opinion. And I get told I don't know what I'm talking about, and I get told that I am trying to ruin the youth of today. So I'm kind of tired of trying to convince men to not do certain things. My other problem that I find, which is terribly toxic for men, is other men telling them about their behavior patterns. This is what a woman wants. And I find this really, really frustrating, because not only are they telling other men, how they should be behaving with a woman, but they're also telling women what they should find attractive. So in effect, you're basically silencing women. Here we are trying to say to women, okay, let's come out of that shell. Let's break that taboo. Let's break that stigma. Let's talk about what really ignites you, what really helps you to to want to be with somebody. You have the guys saying, well, if you don't have a body like this, no woman is ever going to want you. So you have a guy who might otherwise be totally charming, but he's setting out into the world with all of these complexes and insecurities because his male friends have told him this. So he's already approaching women with a set of negatives. And when that happens, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, when that happens, he's like, yeah, these women are terrible. They don't want me because I don't look like this.
So, Seema, right now, more than ever, paradoxically, it seems, although we're exposed to more sex advice and opinions online and just graphically looking at more sex in our modern world, it also seems that people on average are having less sex than maybe half a century ago. Why is that? And how can someone re-energize their own sexual life with some actionable tips?
So I think that just like we've got so many platforms which are teaching us about sex, there's also an equal number of platforms that are coming in at us and saying what a bad thing it is. So there's a huge shift along those lines as well. There's also this whole shift towards, let me say, in air quotes, spirituality. And somehow a lot of people seem to feel that abstinence is the path to heaven. So there is a great deal of people kind of trying to follow down that path. I think also the most important part, I think, for me is that a lot of women are finally getting to this point of understanding their own bodies and understanding what they do deserve when it comes to sexual pleasure. Because even though in the past people were having a lot of sex, it wasn't necessarily pleasurable for women. It was a chore. It was a duty for most of them. And I think that along with our autonomy, women are taking control of their bodies and they're saying what they will or won't find acceptable. And, laying down boundaries, putting down their side of things as well. And I think in a way, maybe it's not such a bad thing that people aren't having sex if they're waiting for it to be the right kind of sex. They're making sure that, one, they're safe, that there's no risk of infections. The other is that they're safe in the sense of not going to be attacked by somebody and so on. So there is also that huge ability to say no that is playing into it. And I think that's not a bad thing. And finally, I think a lot of women have realized that, as we started the podcast with saying, that vaginal penetration doesn't lead to very much pleasure. But if they do have a sex toy, they can find much deeper pleasure with that. And maybe that just becomes easier. So I think it's just a case of not finding the right person, not being absolutely certain that they're with the right person, and wanting to make sure it's a combination of being safe and being happy.
Yeah, and I think one of certainly the biggest takeaways that I think a lot of people should take away from this is to be less didactic and dogmatic in their approach to sex, particularly men who clearly have an easier route to orgasm and pleasure than women. So it's difficult sometimes to break the monotony, which is so easy to achieve the end result for many people, which is an orgasm or climax. So actually just being more open-minded and explore and, treat it as a journey rather than, a destination. And I just want to thank you for, coming and sharing your expertise and being so open about sex. And I think, I'd love to have you on again because, I feel we've only scratched the surface of sex.
Thank you so much for having me, Karan. And yes, I think we definitely need to talk about this again and clear up some other myths.
Thanks again to Seema Anand. Next episode, we meet evidence-based nutritionist Alan Flanagan, who spends a lot of time debunking all of these crazy nutrition myths out there. He'll help us make sense of the lies we're being told to make nutrition simple and easy. Subscribe so you don't miss that and the weekly Dr. Karan Explores podcast. I'll see you naughty gnomes next week.